It was the kind of morning that belonged only to old English legends, a haze of gray pressing in over Hawthorn Green, the tiny village cradled between hedgerows and fields, just starting to thaw from another endless winter. The drone of a faraway tractor rose and fell like a memory, but otherwise, there was only the stillness, the kind you could feel pressing on your chest if you stood out on Hedge-Row Lane, where the village seemed to end and wild country began. No one in Hawthorn Green remembered a time before Bracken. For 10 years, every dawn, in every kind of weather, that Welsh Cob stood watch by the edge of the lane, a chestnut shadow with a white star blaze on his forehead. He was like a fixture, like the twisted old oaks along the lane or the battered milestone at the crossroads. Some kids, heads pressed to bus windows in the dark winter mornings, called him the ghost horse because of the way the fog curled around his legs. Others, with more imagination, or maybe just more kindness, whispered that Bracken was waiting for something, or someone, he'd lost. Nobody really knew his story. The villagers made up plenty of their own, passing tales over pints at the Spotted Hare or folded into conversations in the tiny co-op. But one thing was certain: Bracken never left. Rain, sleet, even the howling March snow that turned the lane into a slick, silent channel, he stood his ground. Sometimes he paced, sometimes he just stood with his head low, watching cars pass, eyes half shut as if dreaming of somewhere far off. On this morning, though, he looked almost regal, nostrils wide, steam billowing with every breath, the white mark on his forehead glowing against the battered chestnut coat. The world was so quiet you could hear the soft thump of his hooves as he shifted from one side to the other. Then, like a ghost, a drone swooped overhead, slicing through the silence. It was flycam footage for a new local history project, but the lens lingered on Bracken, framing him against the wet fields and the distant church tower. In that moment, with the sun struggling through the fog and the horse standing sentinel, the image was something out of time. Why did a horse like that, a pedigree animal with the build of a champion, choose to stay in this lonely place? The Norfolk Echo, the closest thing the region had to a proper newspaper, published a photo the next day. "Sentinel in the Mist," the headline read, and underneath, a short, sharp question. Why is a thoroughbred still waiting here? People in the village didn't like outsiders poking around, especially with cameras and questions, but even they felt a twinge of curiosity. And if anyone looked a little closer at Bracken, it was impossible not to feel something more. Something like awe, or maybe a distant sorrow, seeing that stubborn animal day after day, braving the cold and the rain, never leaving his post. The first person to notice Bracken that day, truly notice, was Jean Wilkins, a woman of 76 who'd lived in Hawthorn Green her entire life. She walked Hedge-Row Lane with a slow, shuffling determination, carrying a bag of fresh hay and half a dozen carrots in her battered old tote. She'd been bringing food for the poor dear for as long as anyone could remember. She'd speak to him in low, soothing tones, not expecting an answer, just the simple act of kindness that gave her own routine some shape. Bracken, for his part, kept his distance, never coming closer than a few feet, but never running, never showing the wild fear you sometimes see in abandoned horses. He seemed to understand, in his own quiet way, that she meant no harm. The village was waking up. The bells from St. Martin's tolled across the fields. Somewhere down the lane, the Hawthorn Green cricket team, a half-dozen boys and girls in muddy white, gathered for an early practice, their shouts faint against the hush. Life went on as usual, but the air was heavy with something more, an expectancy, as if everyone was waiting for the morning to decide what kind of day it would be. At the Spotted Hare, the local pub, landlord Pete was already polishing glasses behind the bar, radio turned down low. He glanced out the window every now and then, half expecting to see the horse and John, a silhouette against the drifting mist. It was just another morning, but for the first time in years, the story of Bracken felt different, more urgent, more uncertain. Even the regulars, hunched over mugs of tea, talked in hushed tones about the photo in the paper, the rumors online, the way people from outside were starting to notice the lonely horse of Hawthorn Green. That sense of something about to happen hung over the village like the fog itself. Back on the lane, Bracken raised his head as the drone made another pass, the sound sharp against the hush. His ears flicked, his muscles tensed, not in fear but with a restless, searching energy. He looked beyond the fields, beyond the village, as if he could see something or someone coming, something only he was waiting for. Nobody knew, as the morning faded and the sun finally broke through, that this would be the last week Hawthorn Green would ever belong to its secrets. Bracken's watch was almost over, and soon the whole world would be watching. The morning that changed everything started just like any other. The air damp and cold, the clouds rolling low over Hawthorn Green. But for Oliver Brooks, that Wednesday was the first time in years he'd felt a real thrill of possibility. The kind that got him out of bed before sunrise and pushing his old Nissan hatchback up muddy country lanes. He'd come chasing fog and stillness, hoping to catch a photo for his freelance portfolio. Something with enough soul to sell to the city papers and maybe, just maybe, go viral for once. Oliver wasn't from Hawthorn Green, though his grandmother used to tell stories about summers spent there as a girl. To him, it was just another dot on the map, another detour in his restless circuit around Norfolk. But the rumor of the sentinel horse had piqued his interest. There was something about it, an animal out of place, out of time, standing its lonely ground. He'd read about Bracken in the Norfolk Echo just the day before, the image already haunting in its quiet way. He parked near the churchyard, boots squelching as he made his way through grass slick with dew. The world felt hushed, every noise swallowed by the thick white mist. He had his camera slung around his neck, a battered old Nikon, the kind he trusted to pick up light and shadow the way his eye never quite could. And then he saw Bracken, standing just where the article had said, by the broken fence post at the edge of Hedge-Row Lane, steam rising from his nostrils, mane tangled and matted with last night's rain. For a moment, Oliver almost forgot to breathe. The scene was perfect. A horse alone in the mist, posture proud but eyes haunted, a living echo of some old heartbreak. He didn't try to get closer, didn't want to disturb whatever ritual Bracken was keeping. He snapped photo after photo, moving along the fence, each image framed by that ghostly morning light. And then, just as the sun started to push through the clouds, Bracken lifted his head and stared straight into Oliver's lens. It was the kind of moment photographers dream about, raw, unguarded, full of unspoken longing. Oliver felt a jolt run through him, something almost electric. He snapped one last shot, heart pounding, and then the spell was broken. Bracken turned away, hooves sinking into the soft mud, and the mist seemed to swallow him whole. By the time Oliver got back to his car, his fingers were numb and his boots were soaked through, but he knew he had something special. He drove straight to his rented flat in Norwich, the adrenaline carrying him all the way. then spent the next hour editing and uploading the images to his socials. He wasn't expecting much, maybe a handful of likes, a polite comment or two from friends. Instead, the response exploded almost instantly. Within an hour, the shot of Bracken, head held high, fog curling around his legs like sea smoke, was being shared across Reddit UK, Twitter, or X, as some insisted on calling it now, and even a few international Facebook groups devoted to animal rescue stories. People started tagging animal welfare organizations, demanding to know why a horse like that was left alone, what the authorities were doing, who was responsible. Oliver's phone blew up with notifications. His inbox flooded with interview requests, comments, and even a few angry rants about British neglect and rural cruelty. He watched as his post was upvoted to Reddit's front page, the comment section a swirl of concern, outrage, and curiosity. Somebody has to save that horse. Why isn't the village doing anything? I'd drive out there right now if I could. He looks like he's waiting for someone. There were rumors, too. Whispers about Bracken's past, about the family who had once owned him, about why he refused to leave that lonely stretch of road. The pressure mounted fast. Local animal charities started to weigh in, promising to investigate. Someone posted an old news clipping about Sunset Paddocks, a horse farm outside the village that had closed years ago, its animals sold off during the financial crash. Others speculated wildly, spinning stories about Bracken's loyalty, his supposed heartbreak, his refusal to abandon his post. Some even offered money to whoever could rescue the famous sentinel. The whole village felt the change. At the Spotted Hare, Pete shook his head as he scrolled through his phone, the bar buzzing with talk of the Reddit horse. Jean Wilkins was stopped twice on her way home, asked if she knew who fed him, if she'd seen the photo online. Even the vicar at St. Martin's mentioned Bracken in his morning prayers, quietly thankful the world had finally noticed what the village had lived with for years. And yet, there was unease. Some villagers resented the sudden scrutiny, the strangers arriving with cameras and questions. Others worried about what would happen next. Would authorities come and take Bracken away, force the village to answer for something that felt, to them, like an old wound that never quite healed? Kids gathered in knots at the edge of the lane, watching the reporters, whispering about what it all meant. Oliver found himself swept up in the storm. He gave interviews, fielded questions, tried to tell the truth, that Bracken was cared for, in his way, by people like Jean, that no one really understood why he stayed, but that he seemed determined to keep his vigil, come what may. But the internet is never satisfied with mystery. They wanted a resolution, a savior, a villain, something simple to share. #forget. As night fell over Hawthorn Green, the image of Bracken, silent, stoic, alone, spread far beyond the muddy lanes and ancient hedgerows, reaching people who had never heard of the village and would never visit. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the horse in the mist was no longer just a legend for local children. He belonged, for better or worse, to the world. For a brief moment in time, Hawthorn Green seemed to pause, as if even the weather itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The morning after Oliver's photograph swept across the internet, the lane was quieter than usual. People lingered by windows, curtains twitching, and the early fog felt heavier, unwilling to lift. The rhythm of the village was still there. The chime of St. Martin's bell at 8, the soft rumble of the bakery's delivery van, the distant crack of a cricket bat as kids snuck in a few swings before school. Yet beneath it all ran a current of unease, a sense that their lives had shifted in ways no one had chosen. At the Spotted Hare, the pub's regulars gathered earlier than usual, drawn by curiosity and a kind of communal anxiety. Pete, the landlord, wiped down the bar with extra care, his phone pinging with messages from friends in Norwich and even a cousin in London. Everyone had seen the photo by now, Bracken standing solemn in the mist, a symbol for something bigger than the village itself. They argued quietly about what should be done, voices low and tense, nobody wanting to be the one to say out loud that maybe, just maybe, things had gone too far. John Wilkins sat at her usual table by the window, a pot of tea cooling in front of her, eyes fixed on the far end of Hedge-Row Lane where the mist still clung to the fields. She'd been bringing food to Bracken for years, a ritual that gave shape to her days. But now she found herself wondering if it was enough. Should she have tried to do more? Should she have called someone sooner? Told someone about the horse's story instead of just caring for him quietly, hoping no one would notice? She watched as a group of teenagers gathered by the fence, phones out, snapping photos and laughing, their voices echoing strangely in the thick morning air. Not everyone in the village was pleased with the attention. Mr. Hargreaves, who ran the little grocery by the war memorial, grumbled about busybodies from the city and threatened to put up a sign. No photography, locals only. The vicar, Father Gregson, tried to reassure people that all would be well, that these things pass just like the mist. But even he sounded unsure, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. The children, for their part, seemed thrilled, a real story unfolding in their own backyard, the kind of thing you could tell friends about and see on the news that night. Bracken himself remained unchanged by all the fuss. That morning, as Jean made her careful way up the lane, she found him standing in the same spot, his coat still damp from last night's rain, his eyes calm but distant. He accepted a carrot from her hand, then turned away, flicking his tail as if bored with the whole spectacle. She stayed a while, talking to him in low, soothing tones, telling him about the latest gossip and the worries of the village. "You're famous now, old boy," she said softly. "Famous and still all alone." The horse flicked an ear but kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. Later, Oliver returned, not as an outsider this time, but as someone the villagers now recognized. He tried to be invisible, hanging back by the stone wall, snapping a few more photos, but he could feel eyes on him everywhere he went. He tried to talk to Jean to get her to share Bracken's history, but she shook her head. "It's not my story to tell," she said. "Some things belong to the past." Still, she offered him a cup of tea, and for a while they sat together in the silence, listening to the steady hum of the village around them. In the afternoon, the pace slowed even further. The kids headed off to school, the bakery sold its last loaf, and the pub filled with the gentle clink of pint glasses and the low drone of the radio. News trucks appeared at the edge of town, their logos bright and out of place against the ancient stone and tangled hedgerows. A reporter from the BBC tried to get an interview, but most villagers brushed her off, unwilling to see their quiet corner turned into the next viral circus. Inside the Spotted Hare, the conversation turned to memories. Old Mrs. Morgan recalled the day the Harris family left the village years before, the way their little girl had cried when they loaded the last of the horses onto the trailer, how Bracken had reared and whinnied, refusing to board, breaking free and vanishing into the morning fog. "He's been waiting ever since," she said, voice trembling. "Waiting for what? No one knows." A hush fell over the bar, as if everyone was sharing the same bittersweet ache. Outside, life went on. The bells rang for noon prayers, the mailman cycled past with a wave, and a line of cars wound down the main street, headlights shining in the pale light. But the village itself felt different, charged with anticipation and anxiety. Bracken became both a comfort and a reminder of something lost. Loyalty, perhaps, or hope, or simply the way things used to be before the world found them. As dusk approached, a gentle rain began to fall, beating on the horse's coat, soaking into the earth. Jean brought him a fresh armful of hay, her old coat pulled tight against the chill. She lingered, one hand resting lightly on the fence, the other holding out a treat she knew he'd refuse. Bracken watched her with those deep, steady eyes, then turned away, his silhouette dissolving into the gathering twilight. All along the lane, lights flickered on, one by one, tiny beacons in the gloom. The world outside might have changed overnight, but in Hawthorn Green, some things held fast. The land, the people, and the horse in the mist. They waited together, each in their own quiet way, for whatever was coming next. By the end of that strange week, the tension in Hawthorn Green had become something you could taste, like the damp in the air just before a thunderstorm. It seemed as if the whole village was holding its breath, waiting for the next headline, the next stranger with a camera, the next knock on the door. But for Oliver Brooks, the unease had turned into restless curiosity. He couldn't stop thinking about the horse, the unwavering loyalty in Bracken's eyes, the way the villagers circled their wagons but refused to speak of certain things, the rumors swirling around a vanished family and a forgotten farm. The story was everywhere online, but to Oliver it all felt too shallow, too thin. He wanted answers, not just clickbait sympathy or another hashtag for the internet to burn through and abandon. He decided that Saturday to do what he'd always done best: dig deeper. Armed with a notebook, a battered camera, and a stubborn streak, he started asking questions, searching for threads in the tapestry of the village's history that might lead to the truth. He began at the village library, a squat brick building squeezed between the post office and the bakery, where the scent of old paper and lemon polish lingered in the air. The librarian, Mrs. Carrow, was a thin, sharp-eyed woman who eyed Oliver warily at first, but softened when he mentioned Bracken. "He's not like other horses, that one," she said, voice dropping. "Always knew there was more to his story." She pointed him toward the archive room, where boxes of old newspapers and ledgers filled the dusty shelves. It took Oliver hours, combing through yellowed pages, squinting at faded ink and smudged headlines. But then he found it, a series of articles from 2013 buried in the back pages of the Norfolk Echo. "Sunset paddocks sold at auction," one read. "Local family faces eviction." His pulse quickened as he skimmed the text. The Harris family, owners of a modest horse breeding operation on the outskirts of the village, had been forced to sell everything after the financial crash. Their horses had been auctioned off to cover debts, the farmhouse repossessed. A short, somber column listed the names of the animals sold. But one name was missing: Bracken. There was another article, dated a week later. "Mystery at Hawthorn Green. Prize stallion missing." It described a commotion the morning after the auction, the horse vanishing into the fog before he could be loaded onto the trailer. The villagers had searched the fields for days, but no trace was ever found. Over time, the story faded, absorbed into the rhythms of rural life, just another heartbreak among so many. Oliver felt a chill run down his spine. He snapped photos of the articles with his phone, then pulled up a map of Norfolk on his laptop, tracing a line from Hawthorn Green to Manchester, a journey of nearly 200 miles. The auction house records showed that most of the Harris family's horses ended up far from the village, scattered across England. But Bracken had simply disappeared. He thought of the horse's stubborn loyalty, his refusal to leave the lane even after all these years. What was he waiting for? He needed more. Leaving the library as the sun dipped behind slate-colored clouds, Oliver made his way to the edge of the village, where the old Sunset Paddocks farmhouse stood in ruin. The windows were boarded up, weeds choking the once neat gravel drive, the fence posts leaning drunkenly in the soft earth. He walked the perimeter, camera at the ready, catching glimpses of the world as Bracken might have seen it all those years ago. A home lost, memories locked behind rotting doors. As he turned to leave, he spotted a neighbor working in the garden next door, a woman in her 50s, face weathered by years of wind and worry. He introduced himself, careful not to startle her, and asked if she remembered the Harrises. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, then nodded. They were good people, hard workers, loved their animals like family. It broke their hearts what happened. She looked down at her hands, voice softening. The girl, Lily, was especially close to Bracken, wouldn't let anyone else feed him. When the family left, she cried for days. Some say the horse has been waiting for her ever since. That night, Oliver returned to his flat, mind racing with possibilities. He started searching online for the Harris family, piecing together social media profiles, old news clippings, and property records. Eventually, he found a lead, an address in Manchester, a woman named Lily Harris, age 23, matching the timeline. He sent a message, explaining who he was and why he was reaching out. Then he waited, nerves jangling, checking his email every few minutes. Outside, the village settled into uneasy sleep. The mist crept back in, blanketing Hedge-Row Lane, wrapping the world in silence. Bracken stood by the fence as always, eyes glinting in the moonlight, watching for headlights that never came. In the quiet, the village felt haunted by its own memories, each home carrying echoes of things lost and promises never kept. As dawn broke, Oliver finally received a reply. It was short, hesitant, the pain of old wounds leaking through every word. I remember Bracken. He was my best friend. I still dream about him. She agreed to talk, voice trembling in the message. If he's still there, I have to see him. I never got to say goodbye. For Oliver, it felt like the story was finally coming together, the missing piece snapping into place. He packed his bag, booked a ticket to Manchester, and set out to follow the last thread of the mystery. The journey would take him far from the quiet lanes of Hawthorn Green, but in his heart, he knew it was the only way to bring Bracken's story home. The past was no longer just a shadow. Now it was calling them all back to where it began. The sun had barely lifted above the rooftops when Oliver's train rolled into Manchester, the city skyline jagged against the washed-out sky. Everything felt rushed. His heartbeat, the bustle on the platform, the relentless drizzle that painted the sidewalks silver. He checked his phone for the 100th time. The message from Lily Harris was still there, unread since last night. But it glowed like a promise. He didn't know what he expected. A tearful confession, a burst of anger, maybe even regret. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. Manchester was a world away from Hawthorn Green. Here everything moved faster. Traffic thundering down Deansgate, crowds sweeping through Piccadilly Gardens, the endless noise of city life that made Oliver's nerves hum. He found Lily's address in a quiet part of town, rows of red brick terraces standing shoulder to shoulder, rain gutters overflowing onto narrow streets. He rehearsed what he would say as he walked, camera tucked under his arm, backpack heavy with notes and clippings. The door opened before he could knock. Lily stood in the doorway, hair pulled back, eyes red-rimmed but bright, as if she'd been awake all night reliving memories she thought she'd left behind. She looked older than the photos he'd found online, older than 23 even. But there was something unmistakable in her face, a kind of stubborn hope. She waved him in without a word. Inside, the flat was small but neat, crowded with books and the scent of coffee. A battered photo album sat open on the kitchen table, pages thick with old Polaroids. Horses in a sunlit paddock, a little girl with tangled hair and a gap-toothed grin, arms flung around a chestnut pony with a white blaze on his forehead. Oliver didn't have to ask. He knew it was Bracken. He waited as Lily flipped through the pictures, her hands trembling. When we lost the farm, I thought that was the end of everything, she said, voice thin, the words fighting their way out. We tried to keep Bracken, but there was nothing left. My dad said he'd be all right, that horses forget, but I never believed that. I used to sneak back to the paddock every night, hoping he'd still be there. The day they came to take him away, he ran, just gone. I always thought I'd see him again, but we moved and life just went on. She looked up, tears brimming, but her gaze was fierce. You said he's still there? After all this time? Oliver nodded, showing her the viral photo on his phone. Bracken in the mist, defiant and alone, a silent sentinel. Lily pressed a hand to her mouth. He was always waiting for someone, she whispered. I think he was waiting for me. The conversation spiraled through memory and longing, grief and guilt. Lily told stories of Bracken's stubborn streak, how he'd jump fences to follow her to school, how he'd nuzzle her pockets for apples, how he'd refuse to let anyone else touch his mane. Every word seemed to build a bridge back to the life she'd lost. Oliver listened, caught between the urgency of the moment and the weight of the past. Suddenly, Lily's phone buzzed, an alert from a Norfolk news group. Potential evacuation for animals on Hedge-Row Lane due to incoming storm. The words tumbled out, urgent and cold. A heavy front was moving across East Anglia, bringing winds and rain strong enough to threaten low-lying areas. Local authorities were warning that any loose livestock would be rounded up, possibly relocated if deemed a risk to traffic or public safety. Lily's hands shook as she read the headline. They're going to move him. He's in danger. Her voice broke, panic flaring in her eyes. If they take him somewhere else, he'll never understand. He's waited so long, I can't let them just take him away. For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside, rain battered the window, the storm already making its presence known. Then Oliver stood, grabbing his jacket. We can get there in time, he said. If we leave now, we can beat the worst of it. I'll drive. Lily didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, snatching up her keys, stuffing the photo album and a spare raincoat into a duffel. They called her parents. Her father's voice thick with disbelief, her mother's edged with hope. And within an hour, the Harris family was packed into a battered white Ford Transit, the kind you see everywhere in England, half-rusted and forever reliable. The drive south felt endless, the storm chasing them down the motorway. Sheets of rain blurred the windshield, wipers fighting to keep up, thunder rumbling across the wide, flat countryside. Lily stared out the window, jaw clenched. silent tears carving tracks down her cheeks. Her father gripped the wheel, white-knuckled, while her mother murmured prayers and old lullabies. Oliver rode shotgun, heart pounding with every mile. Every now and then, Lily would pull out the photo of Bracken and stare at it, lips moving in a silent promise. Back in Hawthorn Green, the wind began to howl. Villagers watched the sky, worry etching new lines in their faces. Some took turns at the lane, checking on Bracken, their torches bobbing in the darkness as they piled extra hay near the fence. Pete from the pub brought an armful of straw, shouting over the wind, "We'll keep you safe, boy, just hold on." Even the kids pitched in, laying out old tarps and rope to shield the roadside. As the Harris van sped through the storm, hope and dread mingled in the air, each mile bringing them closer to the horse who never stopped waiting. It was a race against time, against the authorities, against the weather, against the years lost to regret. But in Lily's eyes, burning through rain and darkness, there was only one thing that mattered. She was coming home. And for the first time in a decade, Bracken would not be alone in the storm. The sky had turned a bruised, furious gray by the time the Harris family van reached the southern edge of Norfolk. Rain hammered the windshield in relentless sheets, wipers slapping back and forth as if trying to beat back the entire storm. Each mile felt heavier than the last, headlights flickering across deserted roads, the world shrinking to the narrow cone of light, and the sound of Lily's breath coming quick and shallow beside Oliver. Inside the van, silence fought with the radio, which sputtered storm warnings and road closures across every frequency. Lily clutched her photo album tight in her lap, fingers curled around the dog-eared picture of Bracken. Her father, knuckles white on the steering wheel, leaned forward in his seat, eyes darting from the road to the sky. Her mother sat quietly behind, lips moving in soft prayer, the kind that falls somewhere between hope and desperation. Oliver texted updates to Gene Wilkins and Pete at the Spotted Hare, their replies clipped and urgent. "Hang on, Hedge-Row Lane still clear? Bracken's all right so far." As the van barreled down the M6, wind buffeted the sides, shaking the doors and rattling nerves. Trucks roared past, sending up waves of dirty water. And once, a fallen branch appeared out of nowhere, forcing Mr. Harris to swerve hard and nearly land them in a ditch. The only thing that held them together was the thought of Bracken, alone out there, facing a storm he couldn't understand, still waiting after all these years. Meanwhile, back in Hawthorn Green, the village had become a flurry of activity. Word spread faster than the weather could catch up. Pete organized a handful of regulars from the pub, grabbing every bale of straw and tarp they could find. Someone brought an old roll of chicken wire. Others brought shovels, flashlights, lengths of rope. Even the kids from the cricket team, soaked to the bone but brimming with stubborn resolve, worked alongside their parents. They built a makeshift corridor of straw and canvas along the side of Hedge-Row Lane, guiding Bracken away from the road and closer to the safety of the churchyard wall. The wind tore at their hands, rain stinging their faces, but nobody stopped, not even when the power flickered and died, leaving the lane lit only by battery lanterns and the occasional strike of lightning. John Wilkins arrived with a basket of carrots and a flask of tea, the rain dripping from her old raincoat. She was the only one Bracken let near, her gentle voice weaving through the roar of the storm. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal gate. "Hang on, old friend," she whispered. "Help's on the way." Bracken stood behind the makeshift barrier, flanks shivering but unbowed, ears flicking at every sound. He watched the humans with that same steady gaze, as if trying to piece together the reason for all their frantic movement. Across the field, a team from the county animal control arrived in a white van, headlights sweeping over the huddled figures. The lead officer, a young woman in a yellow raincoat, shouted through the wind. "We've had reports of loose livestock. Is this the horse?" Pete nodded, stepping in front of her. "That's Bracken. He's been here longer than any of us." The officer frowned, clipboard in hand. "We're supposed to take him in for safety, move him to a shelter until the storm passes." The villagers stood shoulder to shoulder, voices rising, refusing to let the horse be taken unless there was truly no other way. "He's safe with us," John insisted. "We've looked after him for years. He won't run." The officer hesitated, glancing at the barricade of straw, at the fierce determination in the faces around her, and finally, she nodded. "We'll monitor from the road. If it gets worse, we'll help. But you all take responsibility. Understood?" A collective sigh ran through the crowd, relief and gratitude mingling with exhaustion. Back on the motorway, the Harris van crawled through a flooded roundabout, the GPS spinning as the storm scrambled signals. We're close," Lily muttered, staring out at the blackness, willing the next sign to be theirs. The last few miles felt endless. Every tree bent double, fields glistening with standing water, road signs half submerged. Then, at last, the familiar curve of Hedge-Row Lane appeared. The van's tires crunching over gravel, lanterns bobbing in the gloom as villagers turned to watch their approach. They spilled out of the van, Lily first, nearly slipping in the mud, Oliver right behind her, heart pounding so loud he could barely hear the wind. The world narrowed to the muddy lane, the barricade of straw, the huddled shape of Bracken standing exactly where he'd always stood. The horse lifted his head, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring as if he'd caught a scent he'd been searching for all these years. Lily didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, calling softly into the storm. "Bracken! Bracken! It's me!" For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold still, the only sound the ragged breathing of the horse and the steady drum of rain on tarpaulin. Then Bracken let out a low, trembling whinny, a sound of disbelief, longing, hope. He took a single step, then another, the years falling away as he moved closer to the girl he'd never forgotten. Oliver watched, breathless, as Lily reached the fence, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. She stretched out a hand, palm open, and Bracken pressed his forehead against it, closing his eyes as if finally at peace. The villagers cheered, voices cracking with relief and awe, and even the animal control officer wiped her eyes, smiling despite the rain. For that one moment, the storm faded, the wind gentled, the rain softened, and the only thing that mattered was the reunion 10 years in the making. Bracken and Lily stood together, surrounded by friends and strangers, the past at last finding its way home through the darkness and the downpour. And somewhere beyond the storm, the sky began to lighten, promising a new beginning for them all. As the night surrendered to the first hints of morning, the world around Hedge-Row Lane was transformed. The storm had finally begun to move on, leaving a silence so deep it felt almost holy. The battered tarps and straw barricades stood as mute witnesses to the chaos that had just swept through, puddles glimmering like glass beneath the soft blue light of dawn. For a long time, nobody spoke. It was as if all of Hawthorn Green had gathered on the edge of something ancient and raw, hearts still pounding from the night's wild race. Lily remained by the fence, her hand pressed to Bracken's forehead, not daring to break the connection. The horse's breath came slow and steady now, his body trembling not from cold, but from the sheer relief of recognition. Around them, villagers wiped at their eyes, their faces flushed from the effort and emotion of the long night. Jean Wilkins stepped forward, her old hands gentle as she tucked a blanket around Lily's shoulders, murmuring words that were half comfort, half blessing. Oliver stood off to the side, camera forgotten around his neck. He watched as the years seemed to melt away from Lily's face. She stroked Bracken's mane, whispering stories from their childhood, quiet memories that didn't need to be shared with anyone else. For a brief, perfect moment, there was no storm, no internet frenzy, no authorities hovering in vans. There was only the girl and her horse, finally together after a decade apart. The sun broke the horizon at last, painting the fields in a honeyed gold. The light touched everything: the battered fence, the muddy lane, the circle of villagers with their rain-soaked coats and tired, proud smiles. Someone started to clap, slow at first, then louder, until the whole crowd was cheering, laughter ringing out, tears bright in the morning air. Even the kids, half asleep and shivering in their damp sneakers, couldn't help but grin. For the first time, Bracken didn't flinch at the noise. He simply stood taller, eyes wide and alive, as if he finally understood he was home. Pete from the Spotted Hare brought out a thermos of coffee and passed mugs around. "Best damn rescue I've ever seen," he said, voice rough. "Never thought I'd see the day." The animal control officer shook Lily's hand, promising to report that Bracken was safe, that the community had done right by him. John lingered nearby, her eyes never leaving the horse she'd fed for so many lonely mornings. She slipped a carrot from her pocket, handing it to Lily, who laughed, a sound that cut through the exhaustion like sunshine. "You still love these, don't you?" she murmured, and Bracken nudged her palm, soft and insistent. Oliver began snapping photos again, not for social media, but because he knew these moments were too precious to trust to memory alone. He caught the sunrise glinting on Bracken's wet coat, the way Lily's father wiped his eyes when he thought no one was watching, the villagers hugging in relief and pride. He photographed the barricade, the scattered tools, the muddy footprints, signs that, together, they'd managed to hold back disaster, if only for a night. As the morning stretched on, the crowd thinned. Parents rounded up their children, promising hot breakfasts and stories to tell at school. The animal control van drove off, headlights cutting through the mist, leaving behind only the locals and the small, silent circle around Bracken. Someone fetched a dry blanket from the church, draping it over Lily's shoulders and pressing her close. She sank to the ground, laughing and crying all at once, while Bracken stood guard above her, nostrils flaring, tail swishing lazily. The conversation turned soft and reverent, villagers swapping stories about the horse and the farm that used to stand at the end of the lane. Mrs. Morgan remembered the day the Harrises first arrived, how Lily would spend hours braiding Bracken's mane, singing him lullabies. "Never seen a bond like that," she said quietly. Others nodded, sharing their own memories. How Bracken would follow the children along the fence line, how he'd let the youngest kids stroke his nose if they moved slow enough, how he'd watched every family picnic and Sunday walk from his lonely post. Lily listened, eyes bright and shining with gratitude, but always her attention returned to Bracken. She leaned close, whispering secrets only he would ever hear. "I'm sorry I left you. I'm so sorry," she murmured, voice shaking with love and guilt and relief. Bracken responded by lowering his head, pressing his forehead to hers. One last confirmation that no matter what had happened, all was forgiven. Oliver felt his own throat tighten. He watched as the last of the mist drifted away, revealing the lane and fields washed clean by rain. The air was sharp and fresh, filled with the promise of something new. In that golden light, it felt as if the whole world had shifted, as if the pain of the past had finally been paid in full. The villagers lingered, unwilling to leave the scene that had changed them all. Jean poured more tea, sharing her flask with anyone who needed warmth. Pete started cleaning up the barricades, kids racing to help, the rhythm of normal life slowly returning. But every so often, someone would stop and stare at Bracken and Lily, as if reminding themselves that miracles did still happen, even on a muddy English lane. As the village returned to its routines, Hedge-Row Lane stood as proof that even the deepest losses could be healed, that even the longest waits could end in joy. And at the center of it all, a girl and her horse remained locked in an embrace, their shadows stretching long in the new morning. The sun had climbed high enough to burn off the last scraps of mist, drenching Hawthorn Green in clean, sharp light. The euphoria of reunion lingered on Hedge-Row Lane, but beneath the relief, a new uncertainty was blooming, one that weighed on Lily's chest as she leaned against the fence, still unwilling to step away from Bracken for even a moment. The villagers went about their chores, the pub returned to its quiet hum, and kids' laughter faded down the lane. But for Lily and her family, the world felt suspended, hanging on a question that none of them wanted to ask. Bracken grazed in a patch of clover, never straying far from the spot where Lily stood. She watched him with a hunger that bordered on pain, memorizing the lines of his back, the flick of his ears, the way he moved with both caution and trust. Her parents stood nearby, close enough to offer comfort but giving her space, each lost in thoughts of their own. Mr. Harris kept glancing at the horizon, as if measuring the distance between this place and the city life waiting for them. Mrs. Harris wrapped her arms around herself, silent, her eyes fixed on the horse that had once been a member of their family. Mid-morning brought a new arrival. Dr. Peter Neville, the local veterinarian, his battered Land Rover trailing puddles as he pulled up beside the churchyard wall. He stepped out, rubber boots squelching in the wet grass, veterinary bag slung over one shoulder. The villagers greeted him with the same mix of hope and worry they reserved for moments when a beloved pet was in trouble. Dr. Neville moved with quiet authority, stopping to shake hands with the Harrises, nodding at John, even offering Oliver a polite if slightly suspicious glance. Lily stayed by Bracken's side as Dr. Neville approached, her nerves jangling. Bracken watched the vet with guarded eyes, but didn't shy away. The examination was slow and thorough, checking teeth, lifting hooves, feeling the strong, steady beat of Bracken's heart. Dr. Neville asked gentle questions about Bracken's diet, habits, the condition of his coat, and any signs of illness over the years. John answered most, her voice steady, describing the routines she and a few other villagers had kept. The makeshift shelter, the carrots and apples slipped through the fence in all seasons. When he finished, Dr. Neville stepped back and faced the group, eyes soft but direct. "He's a remarkable animal," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who's seen more than his share of endings and beginnings. But he's not young anymore. 10 years in the open have left their mark. Arthritis in his hocks, some scarring along his flanks, a bit of cloudiness in his eyes. He needs proper shelter, regular medical care, somewhere he can rest without fear. He paused, letting the words settle. "If you want him to have a long, healthy life, I'd recommend a sanctuary. There's a good one not far from here. Briar Meadow Rescue. They have experience with older horses, especially those with his background. Lily nodded, her throat tight. The reality pressed in. The city flat, no yard, no way to bring Bracken back with her. Her family's new life in Manchester was a world apart from this muddy lane. Her parents looked away, unable to hide their sadness. "We can't keep him," Mr. Harris said quietly, the words sharp as glass. "Not the way he deserves." Mrs. Harris squeezed Lily's shoulder, her eyes bright with tears. "We have to do what's right for him, love, even if it hurts." A long silence followed. The villagers watched, some shuffling their feet, others dabbing at their eyes. Jean took Lily's hand, squeezing it. "You gave him back what he was waiting for. That's more than most of us ever get in this life." Lily drew a shaky breath, glancing at Oliver, who offered an encouraging nod. He understood what it meant to let go, to give up the last thing tying you to a childhood lost in the rearview mirror. She knelt beside Bracken, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I'm so sorry, boy," she whispered, "but I promise I won't leave you again. Not really. I'll make sure you're safe." Bracken lowered his head, his breath warm on her cheek, the years of waiting melting into something softer, almost peaceful. By noon, plans were taking shape. Dr. Neville phoned Briar Meadow Rescue, explaining the situation. The staff there were kind, understanding, ready to welcome Bracken, to ease his transition and help him heal. Lily listened to the details: pastures for grazing, shelter for cold nights, gentle hands to tend to old bones. It wasn't what she'd dreamed of, but it was the best she could hope for. That afternoon, the Harrises sat in the church hall, joined by Jean, Pete, and a few other villagers. They shared tea, passed around photos, and reminisced about Bracken's escapades, how he'd once blocked traffic for half an hour to eat windfall apples, how he'd stolen a child's scarf and trotted around the village as if it were a victory parade. The laughter felt bittersweet, but it was real, a balm against the ache of parting. Before evening fell, Lily made one more promise. "I'm going to stay," she said, voice trembling but clear. "At least for a while. Briar Meadow Rescue needs volunteers, and I need time with him. Maybe this is where I'm meant to be for now." Her parents hugged her tight, faces shining with pride and sorrow. As dusk crept in, the last of the villagers drifted home, lanterns bobbing down the lane. Bracken stood close to Lily, ears twitching, tail flicking at flies, at peace for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new goodbyes, but tonight there was only the quiet comfort of belonging, the sense that, whatever happened, they had found their way back to each other. And somewhere on the horizon, a future neither of them could have imagined was already waiting to begin. 6 months later, the sharp wind of autumn swept across the hills outside Hawthorn Green, rustling golden grass on the edge of a new-built wooden fence. Where a crumbling old farmhouse once stood, a different kind of hope had taken root. 5 fresh acres bordered by wildflowers and the hum of honeybees, a neat green sign out front lettered by hand. Dandelion Field Yard, Equine Therapy and Rescue. The story of Bracken's journey had become part of the village's fabric. The kids who once called him the ghost horse now came with their parents for Saturday open days, bringing carrots and shy smiles, learning the gentle art of trust from a chestnut cob with a white star blaze. The older folks, too, found reasons to walk out from the pub or the churchyard just to see the horse who'd waited a decade for his family to return. There was a sense, unspoken but real, that by helping Bracken heal, they'd mended something broken in themselves. Lily kept her promise. She stayed on in Norfolk, trading the relentless gray of Manchester for mornings thick with dew and the clean smell of hay. The sanctuary, once just an idea pitched in the church hall, had come to life through months of effort, paperwork, and the kind of stubborn community spirit that had once shielded Bracken through the storm. She threw herself into the work, learning everything Dr. Neville and the sanctuary staff could teach her about horses, therapy, and patience. Most days, she wore old jeans and boots, hair stuffed under a baseball cap, sleeves rolled as she hauled feed, mucked out stalls, and gently coached nervous children through their first steps in the round pen. Bracken thrived in his new world. Gone was the gaunt, lonely figure haunting the edge of the lane. He grew glossy and strong, his limp fading as regular care eased his aching joints. The staff joked that he'd appointed himself mayor of the sanctuary, always the first to greet visitors, the last to leave the field at night, watchful and calm. It didn't take long for him to find a companion either. A Mustang mare named Sierra, brought in from a rescue in the north, wild-eyed and heavily pregnant. At first, Sierra kept her distance, flinching at sudden movements, shying from the touch of a hand. But Bracken stood nearby, patient as stone, grazing beside her, sharing his shelter in the worst of the November rain. Little by little, the mare let Lily approach, her trust building one quiet moment at a time. When Sierra finally went into labor, a cold wind rattled the barn. Lily was there, crouched in the straw, heart pounding, Bracken hovering just outside the open stall door. The birth was tense, a long night of whispered encouragement and gentle reassurance. But as the sun broke across the horizon, a filly took her first wobbly steps in the golden straw. They named her Faith. Bracken seemed to sense the miracle. He stood protectively over Sierra and her newborn, his old eyes shining with a pride no words could hold. Faith nuzzled at Sierra's flank, tottering close to Bracken, as if she'd known him forever. It was as if the universe had offered a second chance, not just for the Mustang and her foal, but for Bracken and Lily too. Dandelion Field quickly became more than a sanctuary for horses. It was a refuge for children and adults from all over Norfolk. Kids struggling with depression or anxiety, families carrying wounds the world couldn't see, veterans haunted by memories no one else understood. Lily, now a certified therapy assistant, worked with local doctors and the NHS, building an equine therapy program that blended compassion and science. She'd lead kids through the fields, teaching them to brush Faith's fuzzy mane or walk quietly alongside Bracken. There were days when a silent, angry boy would melt into laughter as the old cob nudged his shoulder, or when a teenager who hadn't spoken for weeks would pour her heart out while walking the fence line, hands buried in Bracken's thick mane. Sometimes Lily would watch from the edge of the paddock as the children circled the horses, their faces unguarded, their burdens lighter. She saw herself in every awkward step, every fearful hand, every moment of courage as trust bloomed where only pain had been. She remembered the girl she'd been, running wild through sunset paddocks, and realized how much she'd lost, but also how much she'd found again in this field. NHS therapists who visited Dandelion Field marveled at the results. Equine therapy is still new in Britain, but your numbers are remarkable, one said, flipping through Lily's reports. Rising school attendance, lower anxiety, kids coming off waiting lists for counseling. The sanctuary was featured in the local news, and more families signed up each month. Donations trickled in, enough to build a new shelter and stock the feed room for winter. Through it all, Bracken remained the sanctuary's heart. He stood guard over Sierra and Faith, leading them out to graze each morning, letting the children approach as long as they moved slow. When a new rescue arrived, frightened and skittish, Bracken would greet them first, steady as a lighthouse. Lily often wondered if he knew, somehow, that his own suffering had made space for so much healing. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Lily found herself sitting in the grass beside Faith, who dozed in a patch of late wildflowers. Bracken stood nearby, Sierra grazing quietly at his side. The air buzzed with the sound of crickets and distant laughter from the sanctuary house. Lily closed her eyes, breathing in the peace she'd never thought she'd find again. She reached out, brushing her fingers through Faith's mane, smiling as the little filly leaned into her hand. Above them, Bracken lifted his head, staring out at the fields, ears pricked as if listening for a call he knew would never come again. They were safe. They were home. And for the first time in a long, long while, Lily believed in happy endings, not because they came easy, but because they were built, step by step, in a field of dandelions and hope. As winter's grip loosened and the fields at Dandelion Field Yard shifted from brown to a pale, hopeful green, life settled into its new rhythm. Morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window as Lily brewed coffee, her boots already muddy from turning out Bracken, Sierra, and little Faith. The filly grew stronger every week, legs still gangly but confidence blooming, her bright eyes following Bracken's every move. Even the coldest days felt lighter now, laughter drifting up from the paddock as children gathered for their weekly therapy sessions. What had started as an act of rescue had become something much greater, something that no one in Hawthorn Green would ever forget. One crisp morning, NHS therapists from across Norfolk arrived for a tour. They watched in awe as Faith let a small boy, cheeks pink from the wind, stroke her nose. Bracken circled protectively, Sierra nearby, the three horses moving as a gentle unit. Dr. Neville, now a regular visitor, smiled as he shared the sanctuary's success. The power of horses isn't magic, but it's close. They teach patience, presence, forgiveness. You can see it in these kids. You can see it in us. For Lily, the truth was both simple and profound. Bracken's long vigil had taught everyone something about the nature of love, how it could endure, stubborn and fierce, even when the world changed beyond recognition. She often thought of the way the villagers had come together during the storm, how strangers had become family through shared purpose and kindness. Dandelion Field wasn't just a place for horses. It was a living reminder of what could be accomplished when people chose compassion over indifference. One evening, as golden light spilled across the fields, Lily gathered with her parents, Jean Wilkins, Pete from the pub, and a handful of the old regulars from the Spotted Hare. They sat around a fire pit near the sanctuary barn, mugs of tea steaming in their hands, watching as Faith chased fireflies beneath the wide Norfolk sky. John told the children stories of Bracken's early days, how he'd waited and watched, stubborn as stone, no matter the weather. Pete grinned, lifting his mug. You know, we saved him together, and he saved us right back. The conversation turned to second chances. Mr. Harris, quieter than usual, looked at Bracken, now calm and content in the pasture, and shook his head in wonder. You never know when the thing you lost might come back to you, or when you'll get the chance to make it right. Mrs. Harris squeezed Lily's hand. You found your way home, she whispered, not just for Bracken, but for yourself. Lily smiled, feeling the weight and warmth of all those years, loss, regret, and hope winding together until only gratitude remained. As night crept in, a hush fell over the group. Bracken wandered close, nudging Lily's shoulder with his nose. Faith pressed up against his flank, and Sierra grazed nearby, a quiet trio that had become the heart of the sanctuary. The villagers sat in silence, listening to the horses breathe, the crackle of the fire, the distant song of an owl echoing across the fields. Lily found herself thinking about what she would say to those who still carried their own burdens, those who listened to the story and wondered if second chances were real. She knew now that sometimes loyalty meant waiting, even when it hurt. Sometimes forgiveness meant letting go and opening your arms to something new. And sometimes love simply meant showing up, day after day, for as long as it took. She stood and walked to the fence, Bracken's steady presence beside her, Faith prancing at her feet. The sun was almost gone, but the sky still glowed, a wash of lavender and rose stretching from horizon to horizon. Lily rested her hands on the wood, looking back at the friends and family who'd made this place possible. "Thank you," she said, voice carrying across the field, "for never giving up, not on him, not on me, not on each other." As the stars blinked awake overhead, Lily knew the lessons of Dandelion Field would outlast any single season. The children who came here would carry kindness with them, seeds scattered on the wind. The villagers would remember what it meant to stand together, even when storms threatened to tear them apart. And somewhere deep inside, Bracken would always be the sentinel in the mist, his story woven into every wildflower and whispered in every gust of wind that danced across the grass. The final days of spring brought new faces, new horses, new beginnings. Each rescue, each success, each heartbreak added another layer to the story. But no matter what changed, the spirit of the place remained, a living promise that true love waits, and sometimes, against all odds, it wins. As dusk settled over Dandelion Field, Lily lingered with Bracken and Faith beneath the wide, endless sky. She looked out over the land, heart full, knowing that what they'd built here mattered. She hoped those who heard their story would remember the lessons about loyalty, about healing, about the simple, stubborn hope that makes miracles possible. So if you're listening, Lily thought, let this be your invitation. Support your local rescue. Try the quiet courage of loving something back to life. Come ride a Welsh Cob someday, and let yourself believe in the magic of second chances. The last image was of Bracken, standing tall as the sun dipped behind him, Faith nuzzled at his side, the house lights twinkling in the distance, a promise etched in gold and shadow. True love waits, and sometimes it wins.